Well, hello. Welcome to the New South Wales branch meeting of the ASEG. Tonight we're being joined by Dr. James Daniell from Fender Geophysics, my old mate from Mac Uni, who's waving to the crowd next to me at the moment, the massive crowd. Just before we get into that, I'd just like to thank ASEG sponsors, who you can see here. Thank you to our branch sponsors, including GBG for New South Wales. During the talk, if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A. If you're in the room here, you have to wait until the end, fortunately. No upcoming webinars, just Christmas, and I think we're all looking forward to the New South Wales annual dinner as well, coming up on 1st of December. Member benefits, access to exploration geophysics, free membership for students, half price for retirees, social events, of which we have one coming up. And you can keep in touch via Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media platforms. And just another reminder, annual New South Wales ASEG dinner. I think we still have few tickets left. Should be a good night at the Australian Hotel in the Rocks. Okay, the other one. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Daniell, or as we used to call him at Macquarie Uni last millennia, Jack Daniels. Graduate of Macquarie University, both his bachelor's and master's. Did his PhD at Sydney University while he was at GA. He was at Geoscience Australia for 10 years, and then moved up to James Cook for the last somewhere between 8 and 9 years, and he's recently come back to Sydney to work with Fender Geophysics here in Sydney. And he's giving a talk on the Great Barrier Reef. And I'll hand over to Jack.
All right, thanks, James. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. I apologise for the title of my presentation. I was trying to think of something that was a little bit shorter and snappier, but wasn't to do. But this is something that's kind of fairly near and dear to my heart. You know, for most of the last 20 years, I've been working in marine geology, marine geoscience, geophysics, geomorphology, doing things a little bit kind of left of centre at the moment, working with Andrew over at Fender Geophysics. But when kind of James Austin kind of said, hey, do you want to come and give a seminar? I was like, oh yeah, you know, it's a nice way to help out. And I think there's some really nice kind of stories in what I'm going to be presenting today. So I think one of the things I always kind of like to do is, so I know we've got a fairly bit of a mixed bag in the audience here. How many people would say they've got to regularly work with seismic and seismic reflection? Okay, that's okay. How many people would say they kind of work in kind of soft rock kind of geology as opposed to mineral exploration? So we've got a couple of soft rock people, a bit that way too. So that's okay. So we're a bit kind of bit each way. And I was kind of, you know, fairly sure that the crowd was going to be a fairly mixed group of skills. But I kind of like the idea of telling this story just because I'm a big believer in reusing historical data sets, breathing new life into them and learning information from them. This is a fairly interesting piece of research that myself and some students of mine have been working on for a number of years. And it shows how we can take old data sets and turn them into something really new and interesting. So some acknowledgements. This wouldn't have been possible with a whole bunch of honours and PhD students that I work with at James Cook University. Rob Beeman, who's one of our adjunct researchers up in Cairns. JD Webster, one of my close collaborators at University of Sydney. And Phil Simmons from Geoscience Australia gets a very special mention for this, and I'll kind of get to that in just a sec. James kind of mentioned, you know, my biography, And as I said, I kind of worked at GA from 2000 to about 2012. And as I was kind of leaving there and saying I'm going to go be a lecturer at James University and we'll do all these weird and wonderful things, Phil Simmons kind of just tapped me on the shoulder and said, there's all this data from the Great Barrier Reef and all that to look at. Go do something with it. And so he kind of put me on this path of looking at these data sets, breathing some new life into them, and finding out some really interesting things about sedimentary processes on the Great Barrier Reef. And without Phil saying that, none of this work would have happened. So the Great Barrier Reef, of course, is the world's largest mixed siliciclastic-carbonate margin. You can understand that it produces vast amounts of carbonate sediments at its margins. And it also produces, there's large fluxes of sediments coming in from the hinterland, the largest river systems being the Fitzroy and the Burdekin, with the Burdekin, depositing sediments around air, about 100 k's to the south of Townsville. The system itself is about 2,500 kilometers north to south, so it's massive. It's a really big system, and I'm not going to get too much into the details. I'll touch a little bit on the structure of the Great Barrier Reef, but one of the things I'm going to get out of today is how little we don't actually know about the geology of the Great Barrier Reef, especially compared to some other similar margins, and why that is so, and why there's still a mountain of work to do on the reef itself. As I said, comparatively speaking, we don't know a lot. I was at at James University for 8 years. Vast amounts of work being done on the ecology, the biology, oceanography. AIMS is doing great work up there. So is CSIRO. There's researchers from all around the globe, working on the critters, the fish, the oceanographic processes. But the geology itself, it hasn't really got, quite as much energy behind it. We've got limited amount of deep coring. There's been work done by Peter Davies and John Marshall historically. Jodie Webster University of Sydney right now is doing lots of really good work. There's lots of people at UQ and QUT and other places around the country. Historically, IODP, or the Ocean Drilling Program, have been out to the Great Barrier Reef, I think kind of 4 times, if you include the Marion Plateau and the Queensland Plateau. There actually is a couple of oil wells on the Great Barrier Reef, if you didn't know. I won't get too much into the geology there, but it has been drilled previously, not recently, a long time ago. But there's not really a great long stratigraphic history. They're just in critical massive data, and there's also very limited geophysical data, and that's obviously a lot of what I'm talking about today. So I'm going to give you guys a short history of what seismic data does exist on the Great Barrier Reef and why we don't really have a lot of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the geology of the Great Barrier Reef, just to kind of set the scene and introduce some of the blind spots that we have. I'm going to talk about the reprocessing of these historical data sets, and just do a bit of a compare and contrast with some of the stratigraphy and sedimentary processes we see off Townsville and Cairns. And I'm kind of doing that basically just highlight just how complex sedimentary processes have been over the Pleistocene, and the fact that we're even now just starting to tease out some of that complexity, and just highlighting there's a massive work that still is yet to be done, and probably a lot of work that can't be done because the data just doesn't really exist. So it's a little bit sad. One of the reasons why we don't have a lot of geophysical data on the Great Barrier Reef, nor a lot of oil wells or anything like that, is part and parcel because of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act of 1975. I'm a big believer in the preservation of the Great Barrier Reef, so I'm not here to talk down on any of this, but it just gives a bit of context for why we don't know as much about the geology of the Great Barrier Reef as we would like. The Act of 1975 established the Marine Park as we know it today. It established the Marine Park Authority, which is Cooperumpa. It started to provide the framework for planning and management of the marine park. But one of the things it also did is it prohibited the exploration of minerals and oil and gas on the Great Barrier Reef. And that's one of the reasons why our understanding of the Great Barrier Reef isn't quite as good as what we would know about, say, the Northwest Shelf of Australia. But one of the caveats to this is it also says that you can get permission to do research on the Great Barrier Reef, assuming it is relevant to the conservation of the marine park, which is why, especially over the last 20 or 30 years, we've had integrated ocean drilling program come out with drilled wells, and there is still ongoing research on the reef. It makes it harder to shoot seismic and things like that, but there's nothing that's really preventing you from doing some of the research that we might like to. It's just certainly you can't look for oil and gas, which is fair enough. Another one of an interesting document, and that I think is also kind of pretty relevant to this conversation, is this report produced by Geoscience Australia. Trevor Powell, who was the head of Petroleum and Marine Division for many years, put this together because Geoscience Australia was always occasionally being accused of exploring for oil on the Great Barrier Reef, and they're like, well, no, we're doing all these other things, but all this data exists. And Trevor got really sick of it, and he basically put this document together and said, this is the history of every single seismic survey that's been done on the Great Barrier Reef. So it's there for the public to see and the public to know, and that is freely downloadable over their website. And as Trevor says, he kind of hopes that this record will inform any future public debate about exploring for oil on the Great Barrier Reef, because he just said, look, data's been been acquired in the past, but really it was always a non-event for GA and its previous guys as AXO and BMR. But one of those things that the document does show is there actually was a bit of oil exploration in the Great Barrier Reef. If you look at the years that this data was acquired, it was all the 1960s and a little bit in the 1970s. But it was really, all before it was an established marine park. And so at the time, this was just oil companies doing what oil companies did, doing regional surveys and considering prospectivity for oil and gas. As I said, there's very little after 1970, none after 1980, and pretty much none of it, as far as I can tell, or Geoscience Australia can tell, actually exists as digital data, except for these two surveys. So there's a lot of data there. It's probably paper records, and some of the paper stuff I've seen, it's pretty ratty and it's not much use. But for research purposes, there's certainly some nice digital data sets that are begging to be worked on and to be understood better. The government seismic is a little bit different. It kind of starts in the 1960s and actually finished in 1998. But Geoscience Australia had a very different kind of mandate. They were undertaking marine research, trying to understand the evolution of the continental margin, as well as other places around the country. They did a lot of surveys to support the big IODP drilling programs. So they had lots of small seismic surveys across the GBR, mostly for their pet projects, but nothing was really focused on oil exploration. But certainly they were active, and they actually have probably a dozen or 15 or so seismic data sets that are, again, largely unprocessed, might have one or two reports written about them, but not a lot of it's really kind of made its way into the scientific literature. And that was kind of something that really kind of pushed me on to do what I'm going to do today. So if you wanted to look at where the surveys actually are, we see something that looks a little bit like this. This is all the surveys of digital data. So this isn't the paper stuff. This is everything that's digital. This is where the vessels went. And you can kind of see some interesting patterns here. One of it is, there's a really nice kind of patch here, which is it's a nice high density data. This is all off Townsville, as far south as Bowen. There's a little bit more north up around Cairns, but what you can see is the continental shelf of the Great Barrier Reef is bare. I mean, more or less. I mean, we have no seismic data over any of it. There's a little bit of echo sounder data from the Southern Surveyor and the RV Investigator, but really we know very little about the continental shelf and the shelf edge, just because it's so big and the data that exists is just kind of really compressed into quite a small space. But if you look at the rest of the data, there's some fairly reasonable coverages over the offshore areas, whether it's Marion Plateau, down south here, Queensland Plateau, Townsville Trough, Queensland Trough up here. There's, a fair amount of, there's some fairly useful data there that, really could be turned into something that's a little bit more meaningful and interesting and can kind of shed some light on the reef itself. And so that's the data that exists. And not a lot of it has really gone into a fairly coherent, geological history of the Great Barrier Reef. Most of what we do know, Phil Simmons published in 1983. So that's, that's nearly 40 years ago. And so this is based off a very old data set because we've got one line that was acquired off Palm Passage and one that was acquired off Grafton Passage. And it basically pieced together that was, 5 main mega sequences. You've got an early mega sequence where the Great Barrier Reef and the coral sea itself started to rift open. Then we've got, transgression and the initiation of marine sediments being dumped into, into the what is now the Great Barrier Reef and adjacent areas. And a few more mega sequences on top of that. I'm mostly, for the sake of this talk, interested in the Plio and Pleistocene, looking at sedimentary processes over the last 1 million, 2 million, couple of million years. And Phil noticed something that was really interesting, that there was kind of some fairly different processes happening off Palm Passage. Palm Passage is just north of Townsville, and Grafton Passage is just offshore of Cairns, for context. What Phil basically said is offshore of Palm Passage, at about 25 kilometers of build out at about kind of 450 meters depth. And off Grafton Passage, you've got much narrower sediment build out, but it appears to be a lot deeper. And that actually seems pretty consistent with some of the data sets I'm going to show a little bit later in this talk. If you want to look at some more detailed stratigraphy, IODP drilled a whole bunch of wells offshore of Cairns and the Queensland Trough and Queensland Plateau, not on the continental shelf at all on the continental slope. And they actually saw that if you were looking, again, over the last, couple of million years, the Plio Pleistocene, you see a sequence of sedimentary packages that looks, this is the process data here. This is I guess kind of the idealized data set here, where you see that there's kind of 5 or 6 kind of prograding sequences prograding out from the shelf, and then they turn into aggradational sequences that 2 or 3 sequences that build up, and that was certainly what they saw off Cairns, and they were kind of trying to piece that together. They had core data, and they were kind of suggesting that that the shelf edge was getting a reduced amount of sediment, probably due to the Great Barrier Reef preventing sediments going from the shelf out to the shelf edge. And that was something that was kind of hypothesized back in about 93. But there's always been this ongoing idea that was the initiation of the Great Barrier Reef acting as a barrier to sediments going from the continental shelf out onto the slope and making it further offshore. And they kind of did that based on the data that they had today. And I kind of was always kind of interested in this because I kind of I had my own hunches that maybe that wasn't the case, but didn't really have any data to back that up. And they also thought there might be some early reefs in there as well. One of the things we do know about shelf edge sedimentation on mixed margins is, in most places around the world, we've got this idea of reciprocal sedimentation. And what this suggests is that during periods of low stand or low sea level, the coastline progrades out to the edge of the continental shelf. And in most situations, you start to get sediments being deposited on the continental slope into submarine canyons, and they make their way down into the deep sea. When sea level goes up, sea level comes back into the hinterland, and the reefs start to re-establish themselves out on the edge of the continental shelf. So you tend to have this situation where, out on the deep ocean basins, you get most of your siliciclastic sediments being deposited during low stands, and during high stands, it's dominantly carbonate. And that's something we see in lots of margins all around the world. We see something very different off the Great Barrier Reef. So this is the one model that seems to work in most places, but the Great Barrier Reef seems to be very different. Dunbar and Dickens, who were working at Geoscience, working at JCU in the early 2000s, they actually said that offshore of the Great Barrier Reef, they had about 30 or 40 cores to back this up. This wasn't one data, this was a massive core data set. And they kind of, based on all their cores, they decided that the Great Barrier Reef had more of what they call a transgressive shedding model, where it appears that during high stands, most of the carbonate is deposited in the deep ocean basins. But during low stands, it doesn't really seem to be a lot of siliciclastics there at all. During transgression, there seems to be this big pulse of siliciclastic sediments making it down to the edge of the slope and into the deeper ocean basins. And so they also kind of came to this idea as, was all the siliciclastic sediment being trapped on the continental shelf by the Great Barrier Reef? And, looking at, what they were seeing on the offshore cores, that, was probably a fairly reasonable hypothesis to make. It was also kind of in line with what IODP was saying about their data as well. What we know about reef growth on the Great Barrier Reef, we know that there's Eocene reefs in the Gulf of Papua and possibly on the Queensland Plateau. There's lots of Miocene reef growth on Marion Plateau, Queensland Plateau, Papua New Guinea. But the Great Barrier Reef, we know it today, we only think it's about 700,000 years old. This isn't a long-living piece of geology. Best evidence we've got, based on the limited coring that we've got, suggests that the reef established about 700,000 years ago, but probably wasn't even widespread until about kind of 450 to 350,000 years ago. So it's really quite young. And everywhere we've drilled seems to indicate that the reef itself really just seems to be sitting on antecedent surfaces, which was really just more reef. So what happens when we actually look what the reef is growing on? And this kind of starts to tie in with this idea of, does the reef block sediment deposition to the edge of the shelf? What we know in lots of places around the world, if you look at Belize, it's one of the best studied mixed margins, New Caledonia, Florida. All of these places have a record of reef growth that goes back roughly 500,000 years, which is probably a little bit more than the Great Barrier Reef. But all these reefs around the globe kind of seem to have turned on at roughly the same time. One of the things you see when you start looking at these areas, and Belize is a particularly good example, is that the establishment of the reef can kind of partially explained by the flooding of early mid-Pleistocene low stand fluvial features. If you look at Belize, there's all these interesting kind of rhomboidal reefs seem to be growing on river levees on the sides of paleo channels. If you look at some of the seismic data, down the bottom, the barrier reef itself is actually, fairly happily kind of sitting on fairly thick successions of siliciclastic basin, siliciclastic sediments. And in many places around the world, what you see is everywhere where you see barrier reefs, they seem to be they seem to be arranged in such a way that it kind of mimics the onshore geomorphology. So you'll see, modern day deltas. Offshore, you'll see an older paleo delta that's going to have reef on it. You might have a modern barrier system, and then you have an offshore barrier system that's got reef growing on it. And a lot of these places, what you're seeing onshore actually gets copied offshore, and it has reef growing on it. So reefs tend to like these nice siliciclastic environments. that are often quite coarse, and that's kind of what makes them happy. We don't kind of know that much about what the reefs on the Great Barrier Reef are growing on, because if all those dots there are holes that have been drilled on the Great Barrier Reef, you can see that there's hundreds of kilometres, between some of these holes. We don't really know a heck of a lot. Fortunately, Peter Davies has done historically, and Jodie Webster at the University of Sydney, who's actually one of Peter's PhD students. They've done some really good work on Boulder Reef and Ribbon Reef 5 up here. But you can see, I mean, there's 1,000 kilometres between some of these drill holes, so we just don't really know a heck of a lot. But what they found at Ribbon Reef 5 and Boulder Reef, so it's just north of Cairns there. The reef appears to be growing on older cool water carbonates and non-reefal muds. It's a little bit different to what we see certainly in Belize and other places. McCormick's Cay, a little bit further south, a lot closer to Cairns, 100 metres worth of reef sitting on foraminiferal limestone. There's some quartz sand in places. And then you kind of get down to Heron and Wreck Island, where again, you've kind of got 100, 150 metres worth of reef tract, and it's sitting on some calcareous kind of quartz sand. But we know there's going to be sand down there eventually, but we don't really kind of know from more of a geological and geomorphical kind of context, what the reef is really growing on. Just the data is too sparse, and there's no geophysics that really gives it any more additional context. So this gave me the science questions. It's basically, is the barrier reef an impediment to sediments being transported downslope? A lot of the evidence to date suggests no. I don't believe it, and I'm going to tell you all about that why. What are the reefs on the Great Barrier Reef growing on? And obviously geophysics is going to be a really nice, neat tool to help us see through the reef and see what is going on. And the next part is does any of this historical data actually help? We've got all this data from the 60s and 70s, a bit from the 80s. I'm going to cross my fingers. It's kind of patchy. No one's really looked at it. Let's roll the dice and have a bit of a look at it. And thankfully, we actually have a lot of great bathymetry these days, and that has really helped me out a lot. And the work of Rob Beeman has just, really helped this science incredibly. So what can we do with this seismic data anyway? I kind of showed this. This is the data that exists digitally. I'm going to focus just a little bit more on these three data sets. There's this purple data set that was acquired in 1987, primarily just to support the IODP drilling work in those areas. I didn't really get onto the continental shelf. It was mostly just getting right up close to the edge of the reef and focused on Queensland Plateau and the other areas. But there's these two other surveys. There's this kind of BMR survey 41 and 42. These are the red and orange surveys, which looks extraordinarily extensive. And as far as I can tell, about 2 or 3 lines of data have ever made it into print. And the data is black and white, and it's shoddy, and it doesn't tell you that much. And that is, really all the data that tells you anything about the margin of the Great Barrier Reef itself. So we're going to start kind of drilling into that and seeing, is this useful? Will it tell us anything? And obviously, it's going to tell us something. So I always had this idea, leaving GA, going to JCU, can we take this 1980s, 1970s era seismic, process it with, 2020s technology and really kind of turn it on its ear and do some great things with it. The seismic processing, I have a decent amount of skill with seismic processing without being a guru with it. So I just did the fairly kind of bog standard processing, assigning geometry and navigation, applying bandpass filters and gains, and trace equalization, velocity analysis, NMO, stacks, migration, applied some proprietary demultiple algorithms, gain, filter, export again. This is kind of the stuff you learn in second year exploration geophysics at Macquarie University. I remembered all this stuff. It just kind of came back to me. And so there's not a lot of black magic with the processing. I just kind of used everything I learnt as an undergrad. And I'm going to show this line. This was one of the seismic lines that was acquired as part of Survey 75, supporting the IODP research. This kind of comes from up here, offshore of Cairns. This is the published version of the data from 1993, but obviously black and white, not color. It's a bit kind of grainy. It's full of multiples. It does what it's supposed to do, but it's pretty easy to process it, fix it up, and take what was a fairly nice data set. We've put a lot of effort into removing the multiples, which are these kind of multiple seabed reflections. And all of a sudden we can see that they obviously kind of documented all these infilled submarine canyons. The morphology of these canyons all of a sudden is really just astonishing. And this is, again, a data set that was acquired back in the 80s. And, we're starting to see it in a whole new light just by processing it on, using modern algorithms and modern tools, and I can do all this on a PC. I don't even need a special computer. It just works, and it works wonderfully. So, can we improve the data? We certainly can. But with a lot of this data, there's some interesting observations to make. All this data initially was all on kind of small tapes. There was thousands of tapes per survey. There was missing tapes. There was tapes that weren't transcribed. We had missing navigation. Some of the navigation was garbage, or not all the navigation had seismic associated with it. Some of the metadata was questionable. There was a lot of detective work that went into taking these data sets and turning them into something that was going to be useful. But the theory was there, and for a lot of the data, it was pretty salvageable, and we can do some neat things with it. So I was at GA, back in the day, kind of 10, 12 years ago, looking at all this bathymetry data, because that was what I was doing as part of my job. One of the things I always noticed offshore of the central Great Barrier Reef is there's these very kind of prominent lobes sitting on the edge of the continental shelf. And to me, that always kind of, made me ask some questions about the processes that were going on in the reef, and the work that Dunbar and Dickens had done, and what IODP kind of said about sedimentation on the edge of the shelf. And I had no real mandate to look at it while I was at GA, but when I went to JCU, all of a sudden, I could do this, get a bit more invested with it. And what we know from a lot of previous work, there's actually a lot of really extensive paleo channels coming out from the Burdekin River out to the edge of the shelf in these places. The Burdekin River is obviously the biggest river on the Great Barrier Reef. There's about 1,000 kilotons of sediment per year. And, I'm kind of looking at this going, well, this is the biggest river system on the Great Barrier Reef. There's mapped paleo channels out there. We've got lobe-shaped features out on the edge of the shelf. If it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so I reckon there's probably some deltas out there. I'm going to go investigate that and have a bit more of a look at it. One of the other things that is also kind of fairly important, fairly unique about the continental shelf or slope offshore of Townsville, this is Townsville here, is this really interesting terrace. And so this is the shelf break here. As we know it today, there's this interesting kind of terrace that sits about 20 k's offshore. And Phil Simmons actually mentioned this back in 1983. It's kind of this paleo shelf edge that has subsided over time, and that seems to extend from about offshore of Cairns, down south past Townsville and out towards the Marion Plateau further south. And that terrace actually starts to be a really useful, really interesting aspect when we start talking about sediment deposition on the shelf. So I was kind of expecting these lobes are probably shelf edge deltas. It kind of seem like a fairly logical thing to suspect. And shelf edge deltas, we kind of know these as being one of the fundamental blocks of continental margins. They're delivering sediment to the edge of the shelf. Our shelf is pulled out as a result and expand. They have a close link to sea level low stands. Obviously, when sea level is low, coastline moves out to the edge of the shelf. Sediments get deposited and the shelf expands as a result. Shelf edge deltas can be driven by accommodation or sediment supply. The accommodation-driven deltas are the ones driven primarily by sea level change. And what I want to see with my seismic and in my geophysics, I want to look for clinoforms. So clinoforms are these inclined shapes that are typically characteristics of the delta. So clinoforms are sloping depositional surfaces associated with sediments that prograde out towards the base and into deeper water. Clinoforms in geophysics are, commonly indicative of deltas, though you can get clinoforms in a lot of different sedimentary environments. But it's these kind of prograding depositional surfaces that I'm desperately going to try and find. And so I'm going to have a look at the Anzac, Myrmidon and Bowl lobes, which are adjacent to some of the adjacent reefs. I want to look at the similarities and differences and try and work, tell this story about what all the reprocessed seismic tells us, and try and understand some of the sedimentary processes out there. So this is from Anzac Reef. So we're looking at the southernmost lobe out here. This was one of my first pieces of work. At an honours student do some work out here. One of the interesting things is we kind of had this lower kind of progradational unit and an upper aggradational unit. So superficially, it actually looks pretty similar to what we see off Cairns. So that's nice. That lower stratigraphy kind of seems consistent between Townsville and Cairns. So it's like, well, that's a result. It's kind of continuous over 500 kilometers or so. Some of the other things, I've interpreted, it kind of looks like this, kind of transitional zone is actually a nice, erosional surface. So at some point, sea levels probably dropped and we've had incision. Kind of looks like we've probably got, a bit of a slump coming out here. And so I was like, well, that's, we haven't quite, this is probably the start of the delta up here. We've got what looks like a little bit of a scarp, and you can kind of see that this upper slope terrace, it's just kind of extending right across this lower part of the, well, I guess probably the upper slope. So this is kind of where we are here. This red line is the seismic line. This outline is where I think the delta is, and we have this kind of terrace that seems to extend further and further out into deep water. If we look at one of the adjacent lines, so we're going to look at this red line here. The data quality is okay. We've certainly got evidence of these kind of stacked, prograding sequences out like this. The data quality is okay. We've got pretty strong multiples in shallow water, but I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest, we do have a shelf edge delta out here. I do have some cores out there that kind of suggest that that's out there. Some cores that suggest it's all kind of siliciclastic. So certainly the Burdigan seems to make it out to the edge of the continental shelf without a great deal of trouble. And often what we see in these data sets is there's little kind of reefs that seem to be growing upon the delta. So that was kind of nice. So out at Anzac, like I said, this was the smallest of these lobes. It kind of seems to me that we've got these, the lower stratigraphy is pretty consistent with what we saw off Cairns. We have abundant clinoforms. They're about 120, 150 meter thick. The tops are about 120 meters, which is about low stand, which is about what we expect for a delta. So when sea levels, about 120 meters lower as it was in the last glacial period, so the depth of this thing works out kind of fairly well. So we've got the roll over 120 meters works well. We've got now scarps everywhere on these things. So the things failing on the present day. We've got evidence of reefs that seem to be growing out on the lobe. Got some slump debris out there. And in the bathymetry, there kind of looks like there's evidence of a paleochannel. So I was kind of looking at that, go, well, certainly there's a reef, there's a delta there. It's got reef growing on it. I don't really think that the reef is much of an impediment to sediment deposition as these guys might have thought. And so I decided to look a bit further. So we're going to look at Myrmidon. Myrmidon's the bigger lobe out here. What you start to see is there's actually astonishing kind of clinoform development. You've got a fairly prominent delta lobe out here. You've got another one, big feature out here. You've probably got kilometres of deltaic sediments growing out from the edge of the continental shelf, which is kind of fairly neat. So I was going to say this red line here is where we're looking at. So it kind of goes from the continental shelf. This is Myrmidon Reef right here. And we kind of come right out to the edge of the terrace and actually intersect a submarine canyon out there. What we also see this is the submarine canyon right here. So the edge of the delta is starting to be intersected by a submarine canyon. We've got other kind of small canyon features which are indicating that sediments over time have been transported down slope. So that was quite a neat. So I've got evidence of sediments being transported further down slope. A bit further north, starting to do something that's a little bit more kind of reef-like. There's the deltas are a little bit obscured, but there's lots of reef here, so it's reverberation. The data is kind of quite as good as we would like. But what you see is there's a very definite kind of reef-looking feature here. You've got a reef crest, you've got a well-developed kind of back reef here, sitting on top of deltaic. So it kind of seems to me that the reef here is certainly supporting reef growth, which was fairly interesting in itself. The other thing that we see is evidence of a pretty large infield submarine canyon a little bit further to the north. And so we've got a submarine canyon. It's been interpreted kind of through here. This thing is kind of 4 or 5 kilometers wide. And this does not look like anything that's even on the edge of the modern continental shelf. So we've got this feature that's got nothing to do with the modern geomorphology, but at some point in the past, there was a pretty sizable submarine canyon out there. It's been infilled and no evidence of it today. And so all of a sudden, this data is starting to come up gold. We're starting to see all kinds of wonderful things that no one knew existed. All right, one of the things that really frustrates me about this data set is there aren't any cross lines. I would love one really nice seismic line that went up. Everyone's nodding, going, yes. They're having a nice cross line at maybe the 300 or 400 meters depth that just went up the edge of the shelf. You could probably see all these canyons and things, but there's a decent bloody cross line in the entire data set for some reason. So I've only got to work with what I've got to work with, but this one shard of data is just like, there's a big interesting canyon there that's 3 or 4, probably 4 or 5 times larger than anything that's there in the present day. So Myrmidon. So Myrmidon's a little bit more kind of complex, a bit more interesting than what we saw at Anzac. Anzac's a little bit small and boring. Myrmidon, well, we've got Myrmidon Reef itself, a big, nice emergent reef that appears to be sitting on the delta, pretty consistent with what happens elsewhere around the world. Lots of clinoforms, evidence of deltaic sedimentation. We've also got cores off there that have got siliciclastic sediments in there, so we think, okay, that's a river delta, fair enough. There appears to be multiple lobes, so it's like the sea level's probably gone up and down a couple of times over the last couple of 100,000 years. The verticate's going to come back to Myrmidon, a couple of times over that time. So there's been a lot more sediment deposited there than it was at Anzac. We've got evidence of, there's lots of reef, still a lot more mature reef than we saw at Anzac. Looks like there's slump debris. We've, got some kind of connectivity with a submarine canyon there. So we've got starting to get a nice passageway for sediments to travel further down slope, which is kind of cool. And the third part of the puzzle is bowl. Bowl's a lot more complicated and the data is worse. A lot of the data around this area was pretty crummy. And that's just the way things roll with spark of data sets. But again, we kind of saw, so the bowl kind of delta is this big feature down here. Actually kind of looks like it's got a lot of seismic data on it. Most of it's garbage and I couldn't actually do a heck of a lot with it. But some of the nicer data sets, we've got we've got clinoforms in there. Data is great, but it certainly seems like we've got a bit of reef going on it. One of the things we do see in this data set is also, it's kind of really kind of edges over to the very edge of the shelf and actually, disappears down the edge of the slope and the edge of the terrace in a really big slump. So it's, progressed a lot further than the other deltas we've seen. We kind of go down into that slump. So we're kind of, this slump I'm kind of talking about is, I'm used to looking at this data and interpreting it. So, there's a big kind of slump. There's a big scar right here. And all of this has basically failed and moved down slope. If we kind of go down into there, so I've got a seismic line that's basically going down from the edge of the delta and it turns 90 degrees and heads southeast. We see something that looks like this. We've lost about 200 meters worth of sediment. That's all basically failed and gone down slope. We've got evidence of lots of older, smaller canyon features. So there's been transport down south, down slope, over millions of years, we think. But and so for bowl, in summary, what we kind of see, as opposed to Anzac and Myrmidon, we've got lots of reef growth. There's just reef growth everywhere. There's certainly evidence of clinoforms out there, and unlike Anzac and bowl, it's progressed out to the edge of the shelf. It has just basically failed and fallen down slope, and we've had hundreds of meters of sediment, being moved further down slope. Big slump scar, paleo channels, pointing in that exact same direction. Lots of transport down slope. So I kind of presented the three of those, not to beat you over the head, but mostly because there's a nice kind of transition between the three. And this is something that's kind of worth spelling out. And that, one, we kind of had this idea of, does the Great Barrier Reef prevent sediments being deposited on the slope? And the answer is, well, probably not. And we also kind of see, well, what is the reef growing on? A lot of the reef is actually growing on these shelf edge deltas, which is kind of nice. But we also kind of see that there's, three kind of stages to all of this. There's kind of this juvenile or immature stage where you've probably had the river, depositing over there for, a couple of thousand years during a low stand. It's built out about 2 k's from what was the then edge of the shelf. Small amount of reefs, doesn't seem to be connected to the submarine canyon, and all of this sediment is being caught on this terrace. This terrace is actually preventing sediments going further down further down slope. So one of the reasons why we're not seeing siliciclastics out in the deeper oceans, they're basically just being caught up here on the terrace. They can't really go any further. The next kind of stage is Myrmidon. We've got the delta's kind of prograde kind of 5 or 7 k's out from the edge of the shelf. There's very significant reef growth that we see. You've got a myrmidon coming out of the ocean, so we've got a nice kind of emergent reef. It's starting to get some very real connectivity with some submarine canyons, and probably kind of the fine pro-delta sediments are making their way through the south. Further offshore. And then you've kind of got this mature stage where you've actually got these deltas, this big bulky thing, which probably said, most of its time depositing out here. You've got lots of delta lobes, lots of reef, and this thing has actually progressed so far. It's gone to the edge of the terrace, and the whole thing has just failed. And so there's an interesting kind of sequence here to see how the reefs and the deltas have actually evolved over time offshore of the Burdekin, which was kind of nice. So the conclusions I kind of got to was, well, obviously the barrier reef isn't impeding sediment deposition. We've got large delta systems that have been formed there. The terrace actually kind of holds all of this sediment, so it's preventing most of it from traveling down slope. So it's actually there, and over time the sediments are building out, but very little of it has actually gone down slope as a result. We've got a really nice evolutionary sequence there, so we kind of see how it goes from a mature to an intermediate to a juvenile to intermediate to a mature stage. The scarps are common. Over time, it starts to connect with submarine canyons, but the reef growth is just loves sitting on these deltas. That seems to me that's where they like to live. That seems pretty consistent with what we see in Belize and Florida and all these other places. But one of the other cool things that really kind of came out of this is we always kind of said that shelf edge deltas are the main way that shelves expand. But as those shelves expand, you're actually creating new room for the Great Barrier Reef as well. So as the shelf expands, the Great Barrier Reef itself is actually expanding in response to that. So all of a sudden, we've kind of thrown a bit of what Dunbar and Dickens and IODP was saying about sedimentation on these things. And I thought it was really supported by reprocessing some of this 1980s era seismic data. And so that was kind of neat. I'm going to touch on Cairns in less detail, because I'll probably talked for too long. Getting close. Yeah, so I'm going to finish this up. Jim warned me against talking for too long. There's also 3 passages off Cairns. There's Trinity, Graft, and Flora. I'm going to talk about one of them. The river systems up here are a lot smaller. So the Barron and Mulgrave, Russell River systems have got about 0.1 the megaton of sediment per year. So they're about 1/10 of the size of the ones off the Burdekin. So we're going to have a little bit of a look up here. We're just going to look at Flora, which is the southernmost one down there. And we see lots of clinoforms. Again, looks very deltaic. A bit of evidence of reef. But one of the things you see in the bathymetry is you have a very different kind of shelf edge where you've got canyons coming right up to the edge of the continental shelf and basically intersecting the canyon itself. And I know I kind of cut a lot of stuff out here to hurry it up a lot, but one of the things we do see off Flora Pass is, rather than having these nice kind of lobe-shaped deltas, you've actually got something that's very kind of subtle and cuspate. Looks like it's probably wave dominated. It's getting a fraction of the sediment that the deltas further south are getting. And it's basically being intersected by submarine canyons. As you can see quite clearly there, there's abundant canyons that are coming right up to the edge of the shelf and providing this nice conduit for sediments to go further south. We see a little bit of reef growth out there, not a lot, but probably a bit like what we saw out at Anzac. there's also a paleo channel that basically kind of connects with the submarine canyons. It's like, it looks like that the river itself, you know, basically flows straight into the submarine canyon. So it's very different to what we see further south. So I kind of included Cairns because you see something that's really different to what you see off Townsville. What we saw off Cairns, the short edge deltas, yeah, there are plenty of deltas up there. They tend to be cuspate, they're wave dominated, they're not these nice kind of lobe shapes. And that's kind of partially because we don't really have this really nice terrace up there. The submarine canyons have really made it right up to the shelf edge, so they can't really build out the same way we see further south. There is reef out there. The deltas have gone, you know, as far as they can, but basically all this sediment is really depositing straight into submarine canyons. And so it's the main difference between Cairns and the Townsville areas. We don't really have the terrace up here. We've just got these submarine canyons that come right up to the edge of the shelf. The gradients are a lot higher. And what if that's my alarm to get off? And so you see something that's just extraordinarily different. It's only 500 k's away. Like, it's not, you know, a great deal of distance, but the sedimentary processes are completely different. And so just to kind of finish things off, I kind of wanted to do a nice kind of comparison between the two. When you kind of, you know, see something that looks a little bit like this. I mean, offshore of Cairns, offshore of Townsville, got a large catchment with the Burdekin, you've got lots of sediments. Cairns, smaller catchments, about a tenth as much sediment. Geometry, off Townsville, we've got nice river-dominated delta lobes. They really kind of stick out from the edge of the continental shelf, mostly because they are being deposited onto this terrace. Cairns doesn't really get that at all. Got these kind of small cuspate deltas that really stick to the edge of the shelf. Probably indicate that there's a wave-dominated environment rather than a river-dominated environment. The continental shelf or continental slope off Townsville, like I kind of said, there's this nice kind of broad gradient. And these are just kind of bathymetry profiles that I've extracted out of the seismic. You kind of see, you know, offshore of Townsville, you get this really nice terrace, and then everything, you know, the slope increases after that. When you look at Cairns, you kind of come out here, you know, there's a bit of a terrace here, but, you know, mostly off Cairns, there's no terrace at all. Everything just gets into the shelf and then flows down submarine canyons out to the edge of the shelf. So the downslope, you know, the gradients on the slope are completely different. The downslope transport is completely different. Off Townsville, most of the sediment is captured on the terrace. You know, you saw on Anzac, it, you know, ends up falling down eventually. But off Cairns, there's, you know, this really beautiful connection between submarine canyons and rivers. So if sediment is, if sea level is low, sediment is just powering off this part of the Great Barrier Reef, just going straight down submarine canyons, finding its way down to the ocean basins. And so you're actually probably seeing a lot more sediment making it down slope off Cairns than you do off Townsville, just by part of the fact that you've got, you know, less, you know, steeper gradients, more canyons. And so it's you know, very different. The stratigraphy is pretty similar. We see these deeper units are very you know, the same in both, and we do see reef growth on both deltas in both areas. So it kind of seems to me that offshore of Cairns and offshore of Townsville, there's river deltas everywhere. Reef loves growing there, so it's kind of very past what you see elsewhere. And so I think in a lot of ways, the Great Barrier Reef actually the reef growth is pretty similar to what you see elsewhere around the globe. It's still very different to what you see on the Ribbon Reef, because there is that big core that through Ribbon Reef 5 that kind of terminates in, you know, called temperature carbonates or something like that. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all model. But I just kind of presented this to kind of see, you know, with some reprocessed seismic and some modern day bathymetry, all of a sudden you start to see that there's very interesting sedimentary processes going on in both areas. And, you know, this has been sitting in, tapes gathering dust for 4 decades. And all of a sudden it's just, there it is, the deltas are there, they're happy. You're seeing very different things happening to the north and south. The longer part of this talk is Capricorn Channel is going